Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're looking at something absolutely incredible. How exactly did a scrappy, underfunded colonial rebellion evolve into the massive, globally deployed superpower we know today? Well, we're going to trace that exact journey. It's a fascinating story of trial, error, and adaptation that directly shapes the global security landscape we all live in right now.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Picture this. It's 1784, just after the United States won its independence from Great Britain. The entire standing regular army, which was called the 1st American Regiment at the time, consisted of a jaw-droppingly small 700 men. That is not a typo, folks. Literally just 700 men defending a brand new nation. Crazy, right? To see how we got from there to here, we're skipping the tedious battle-by-battle minutia today and tracing 5 distinct eras of structural evolution. We've got 1. Forging a continental army. 2. Frontiers and Civil War. 3. The World Wars era. 4. Cold War and reorganization. And finally, 5. The modern force. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, Forging a Continental Army. Now, to really understand this early era, you have to grasp just how deeply early Americans distrusted standing armies. It's like right after the Revolutionary War, the Continental Army was basically disbanded overnight. Even George Washington, the ultimate hero of the Revolution, when he submitted his sentiments on a peace establishment, only asked for a tiny force of 2,631 men just to guard the western frontier. But you know what? Even that incredibly modest proposal was repeatedly shot down by Congress. They were on a super tight budget, sure, but they were also terrified that a standing army could pave the way for a military dictatorship. So, since the government flat out refused to fund a regular army, early America leaned heavily on part-time civilian soldier state militias. Regular forces were seen as an absolute last resort. But reality hit hard in 1791. A force led by Major General Arthur St. Clair was almost completely wiped out by the Northwestern Confederacy. It was a brutal, disastrous defeat, but it finally forced Congress's hand. They had to create a trained, standing force called the Legion of the United States, which was officially renamed the U.S. Army in 1796. Moving right along to Section 2, Frontiers and Civil War. Let's move into the 19th century and see how this builds. It was really a constant cycle of conflict. You've got the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War in 1846, the American Civil War breaking out in 1861, and the Great Sioux War in 1876. And here's the pattern. Each of these conflicts pushed a reluctant nation to quickly expand its military forces, only to hastily shrink them right back down the second the fighting stopped. But honestly, nothing in that cycle even comes close to the explosive scale of the Civil War. Get this. 2.2 million men served in the Union Army to preserve the nation. 2.2 million. The sheer manpower and mobilization required for this completely shattered everything Americans thought they understood about warfare. This war forced some absolutely massive logistical innovations and demographic shifts. Volunteer armies were being formed directly by the states. And to keep all those soldiers fed and armed, Quartermaster General Montgomery Meigs engineered a staggering system of 16 massive supply depots. On top of that, demographics shifted significantly. Following the Emancipation Proclamation, roughly 190,000 black soldiers volunteered for the Union cause. It was an unprecedented mobilization. Yet, amazingly, in the summer of 1865, that massive volunteer army was immediately demobilized and sent home.
Which brings us to Section 3, the World Wars era. Now, what's really interesting about this era is how World War I fundamentally destroyed the old militia ideal forever. We completely shift from that early model of irregular, part-time state militias focused strictly on local defense to a very 20th century model. We're talking about a centrally managed, combined conscript and volunteer national army built explicitly for massive overseas deployment.
The sheer scale of this shift was just immense. Look at the targets set by the Selective Service Act of 1917. You have the regular army expanding to 286,000 men, the National Guard jumping to 450,000, and a National Army draft pulling in a whopping 1 million men. The old boundaries just vanished. All these recruits and draftees were absorbed into a single, unified United States Army to go fight on the Western Front. And it wasn't just about getting bigger. The physical structure of the fighting force had to adapt rapidly too. I mean, during World War II, the Army grew to 44 times its pre-war size. But it evolved tactically. Back in World War I, divisions were these slow, massive units of over 30,000 men. By World War II, they shifted to smaller, much more agile structures of 3 flexible infantry regiments. And then, jumping to the Cold War, divisions shifted once again into highly flexible, interchangeable brigades, the mixed armor and infantry.
All right, moving to Section 4, Cold War and Reorganization. So, after World War II, the reality of the Soviet threat meant the U.S. couldn't just disband its army and go home like it used to. But maintaining a permanent standing army brought immense new challenges, and the Vietnam War became a notoriously low point. The army really struggled with the transition from conventional battlefields to counterinsurgency. There's this quote attributed to a U.S. general at the time that perfectly captures the tension. He reportedly said, "I will be damned if I will permit the U.S. Army, its institutions, its doctrine, and its traditions to be destroyed just to win this lousy war." It really exposes how stubbornly the institution clung to mass firepower and how it initially failed to adapt to the complex guerrilla realities of Vietnam. Those painful struggles in Vietnam forced a massive systemic rethink. In the aftermath, Chief of Staff General Creighton Abrams enacted what's called the Total Force Policy. This was a post-Vietnam doctrine that treated the regular Army, the Army National Guard, and the Army Reserve as a single, fully integrated force. Basically, Abrams wanted to guarantee that the U.S. would never again fight a major war without mobilizing its reserves, and, by extension, getting the backing of the American public. So the 1970s and 1980s were essentially a massive decade of reorganization to execute this whole new vision. They took 3 major steps. First, they converted entirely to an all-volunteer force. Second, they formed TRADAC, the Training and Doctrine Command, to completely overhaul how soldiers fought and trained. And third, the Goldwater-Nichols Act was passed to unify the service branches under geographical commands. This meticulous reorganization is exactly what turned a battered post-Vietnam military into the highly trained technological powerhouse that so swiftly succeeded in Desert Storm.
And that leads us to our final section, Section 5, the modern force.
Stepping into the 21st century, the focus radically shifted yet again. Following the September 11 attacks, the mission abruptly pivoted away from conventional desert tank battles and right back into complex, prolonged counterinsurgency in Afghanistan and Iraq. So the crucial point here is that the total force model we just talked about was heavily tested. It required repeated, prolonged tours of duty for both active and reserve troops, plus a rapid pivot to brand new tech, like those heavily armored MRAP vehicles to counter the constant, deadly threat of IEDs.
To really wrap our heads around the breathtaking scale of this history, let's compare active troop counts across 3 defining eras. Back in 1865, the Union Army sat at over 1 million men. In 1945, that drafted World War II behemoth peaked at over 8.2 million. But look at 2023. The active force sits at roughly 453,000. It's such a striking comparison. We've completely transitioned from massive, drafted citizen armies to today's highly lethal, much smaller, all-volunteer professional force.
Which leaves us with this provocative thought. In an era increasingly defined by rapid technological leaps, we're talking drones, cyber warfare, and constantly shifting geopolitical threats, what will the next great structural evolution of the U.S. Army look like? It's pretty wild to reflect on how a nation that once genuinely feared a 700-man standing army will continue to adapt to the battlefields of tomorrow. Take a moment to think about that. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.